They thought a petty HOA fine would make me bow to their power-hungry demands. What they didn't know was that they had just picked a fight with Michael Carter, the chief of police. But this wasn't just about me. When I uncovered their illegal operation targeting first responders, I knew it was time to turn the tables. I'll never forget that morning. It started like any other day, but by nightfall, everything had changed. As I walked out to my driveway, ready for another shift at the station, something bright green caught my eye. Stuck under my windshield wiper was a notice. At first, I thought it was just another takeout menu, but when I pulled it off, my stomach dropped. HOA violation notice, $79, fine for improper lawn maintenance. Are you kidding me? I took a sip of my coffee and turned to look at my lawn, the same lawn I'd maintained for 15 years. It wasn't perfect, but it was neatly trimmed, green, and healthy. It had never been an issue before. So why now? Then I heard it, the distinct clicking of high heels against the sidewalk. That sound alone was enough to set my nerves on edge. Good morning. I turned around to see Karen Mitchell, our neighborhood's newest HOA board member, strutting down the street with her tablet in hand. She'd only moved in 6 months ago, but within weeks, she campaigned her way onto the board. Now, just 3 weeks into her reign, she had made life miserable for nearly everyone. I held up the notice. Mind explaining this? My lawn meets all reasonable standards. Karen barely glanced at me before tapping away on her screen. Section 7, paragraph 3 of the HOA guidelines clearly states that grass height must not exceed 3 inches. I frowned. It's freshly cut. Karen's painted red nails hovered over her screen before she smirked. Yours is approximately 3.5 inches. That's a violation. I exhaled slowly, reminding myself that losing my temper wouldn't help. I've been a little busy this week. Major case at work. I'll mow it this weekend. Karen's smirk widened. Rules are rules. She finally looked up from her tablet. And just so you know, the fine doubles if it's not paid within 72 hours. Then, as if that weren't enough, she added, "Oh, and you might want to do something about those garden gnomes. They're not on the approved decoration list." I felt my jaw tighten. Garden gnomes, the same ones my late wife had collected for years. I wasn't aware I needed approval for decorations that have been here for over a decade, I said, keeping my voice even. Karen gave a mocking little wave. New board, new rules. She turned on her heels and strutted down the sidewalk like a queen surveying her kingdom. I watched as she made her way toward Emily Bennett's house, a hardworking ER nurse who had just finished a 16-hour shift. Karen stopped in front of her property, tapping away on her screen, no doubt finding something else to find. That's when I realized this wasn't about my lawn. This was about control. Karen had made a mistake today. She thought she could push people around. She had no idea what was coming. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to remain calm. Years in law enforcement had taught me one thing. Losing my temper never helped. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was targeting people. And she knew exactly what she was doing. She strolled down the sidewalk, tapping on her tablet like she was issuing parking tickets. But I wasn't the only one in her sights. She had stopped in front of Emily Bennett's house, my neighbor and a dedicated ER nurse who had just finished a brutal night shift. I watched as Karen raised her tablet, snapped a picture of Emily's front yard, then typed furiously. I could guess what the violation was. Garbage bins left out too long. Emily worked unpredictable hours. Sometimes she barely had time to eat, let alone rush outside to bring in her bins at the exact moment Karen deemed acceptable. Something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about my lawn. Back in my car, I pulled out my phone and opened the neighborhood Facebook group. The posts about Karen were piling up. David Morgan, the firefighter on the corner, had been fined for his kid's basketball hoop. The elderly couple across the street, Mr. and Mrs. Chang, had received a violation for unapproved rose bushes. Even Mr. Thompson, the retired teacher, had been cited for parking his car in his own driveway because it was unsightly. A pattern emerged, clear as day. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was targeting hardworking people. I scrolled through the HOA documents online. The board had recently approved a long list of new regulations that seemed designed to punish people who worked long or irregular hours. Who did that apply to? First responders, medical workers, and essential employees. The people who weren't home during the day to fight back. I exhaled sharply, the realization settling deep in my gut. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood in order. This was about control. And Karen was tightening her grip, one ridiculous fine at a time. I looked back at Emily's house. She had finally stepped onto her porch, exhaustion evident in her posture. Her scrubs were still wrinkled from a 16-hour shift. She rubbed her eyes, glanced at the violation notice stuck to her door, and sighed. That was the moment I decided. Karen had no idea who she was messing with, but she was about to find out. I was about to pull out of my driveway when I noticed Karen Mitchell standing in front of my house, snapping pictures of my garden gnomes like she was collecting evidence for a criminal trial. She didn't know it yet, but she had just made a serious mistake. Years as chief of police had taught me something important. The worst crimes aren't always the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're the quiet injustices, the kind that slowly eat away at a community. As I drove to work, exhaustion from a double shift settled deep in my bones. But my mind was sharper than ever. Karen thought she held all the power. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. 2 days later, I returned home late, drained from a 16-hour shift dealing with a bank robbery downtown. I just wanted to park my car and sleep. Instead, 2 black SUVs with HOA security plastered on the sides were completely blocking my driveway. I clenched the steering wheel, watching through my windshield as Karen strutted across my front lawn in her designer suit, tablet in hand, taking pictures of everything. My garden hose, my mailbox, even my welcome mat. With each flash of her camera, my blood pressure ticked higher. I forced myself to stay calm. I dealt with criminals, con artists, and liars my entire career. But Karen, she was something else. I stepped out of my car, crossing my arms. "Excuse me, you're blocking my driveway." Karen spun around, her perfectly styled blonde hair flipping like she was in a shampoo commercial. "Well, if it isn't Michael Carter, our neighborhood's most persistent rule breaker." She tapped her tablet screen with pairs manicured nails, scrolling through what I assumed was my growing list of offenses. Let's see, unpaid fine for lawn height violations, unapproved garden gnome placement, and oh my, she gave a theatrical gasp. "Your mailbox. It's the wrong shade of white." I blinked. "Excuse me?" Karen smirked. "According to our updated HOA guidelines, all mailboxes must be pristine pearl white from the Anderson Paint Company. Yours is classic white, a completely different shade. That's another violation, Chief." I let out a slow breath. She really thought she had me. What Karen didn't realize was that I had already started digging into her so-called authority. And what I was about to uncover, it was going to destroy her entire operation. I couldn't help but chuckle. A non-regulation mailbox color. That was her grand accusation. "Karen, my mailbox has been the same shade of white for 15 years. She smirked, tapping away at her tablet like she was delivering a court verdict. "According to our new HOA guidelines, all mailboxes must be painted pristine pearl white from the Anderson Paint Company collection. Yours is clearly classic white, a completely different shade." Karen looked at me like she'd just cracked a major crime. I exhaled, pulling out my phone and hitting record. "Karen, I understand you're new here, but these security vehicles are illegally parked. They're blocking my driveway, which is a direct violation of City Ordinance 2345. For the first time, her confident smile faltered. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker of hesitation, but I saw it. She quickly recovered, straightening her posture. "I have full authority as an HOA board member to enforce our community standards." She gestured to the 2 men in ill-fitting security uniforms leaning against the SUVs. "These officers are here to ensure compliance." That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Their badges. They were too polished, too shiny, almost like real police badges, but not quite. I knew every licensed security company in my jurisdiction, and Caldwell Protective Services, the name printed on their uniforms, wasn't one of them. I took a deep breath and tried one last time to de-escalate. "Karen, I get it. You want the neighborhood to look nice. But blocking someone's driveway over a $79 fine isn't just unreasonable, it's illegal. I'd hate to escalate this." Karen's smirk disappeared, replaced by a deep shade of red that matched her manicured nails. "Is that a threat, Mr. Carter?" she hissed. "Because I have photos documenting every violation on your property. The HOA board will be very interested in your aggressive attitude. She turned to the so-called security guards. Make a note of his threatening behavior. As they fumbled with their notepads, I noticed something else. Their shoulder patches were peeling off. This was bigger than a power trip. Karen wasn't just enforcing ridiculous rules. She was hiding something, and I was going to find out what. The peeling patches on their uniforms looked like they had been printed at a local copy shop, cheap and unprofessional. My gut told me something wasn't right. I pulled out my phone and quickly searched the city's business license database, keeping an eye on Karen, who was still busy snapping pictures of my property like she was building a case for a federal indictment. 3 taps later, I had my answer, or rather, the lack of one. There was no licensed security company under the name Caldwell Protective Services. Even more interesting, there was no record of any business license tied to Karen or her brother Ryan Caldwell, whom I had seen at the last HOA meeting wearing a similar uniform. Before I could process this, Maria Lopez, my neighbor, came rushing out of her house, still dressed in her hospital scrubs. She looked frantic. "Chief Carter, I'm so glad you're here. They've been blocking my driveway too, and I'm late for my hospital shift." Karen froze at the word chief. Her eyes widened, and for just a fraction of a second, her grip on her tablet slipped. So she didn't know who I was. Interesting. But Karen was a professional manipulator. She recovered quickly, lifting her chin like she was the one in control. "Your title doesn't matter here, Chief Carter," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "HOA rules apply to everyone equally. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to document a few more violations before processing additional fines for your uncooperative behavior." She turned sharply, clutching her clipboard like a shield, and strutted off toward another house. I exhaled slowly, watching her. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just the beginning. Karen had been so confident, so smug, wielding her fake authority like a weapon. But what she didn't realize was that she had just made herself my #1 priority. I didn't know how deep this ran, but I was going to find out. And when I did, Karen's perfect HOA kingdom was about to collapse. The next morning, Emily Bennett knocked on my door just as the sun was rising. She was still in her hospital scrubs, her hands shaking as she held up a stack of bright orange violation notices. "Chief, they're threatening to put a lien on my house over a garbage bin." I frowned. "A lien?" She nodded, her voice trembling. "I worked a double shift during the crisis last week. I barely had time to sleep, let alone bring in my garbage bin the second Karen decided it was out too long. I flipped through the notices, my anger rising with each one. Violation after violation, for minor things like a garden hose improperly stored and curtains visible from the street. I had seen plenty of corruption in my career, but this was something else. And Emily wasn't the only one. I started asking around, and the stories poured in like floodwater. David Morgan, the firefighter on Maple Street, showed me a stack of citations for his kid's basketball hoop. A hoop that had been in the same spot for 5 years with no issue until Karen took power. The Martinez family had been fined because their Christmas lights were still up 2 days past Karen's arbitrary deadline. They had been out of town for their grandmother's funeral. By the end of the day, my kitchen table was covered in violation notices, complaint letters, and photos. The pattern was clear as day. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was targeting specific people. Every single major fine or citation had been issued to first responders, nurses, doctors, and firefighters. People who worked long or irregular hours and couldn't immediately comply with her ridiculous demands. It wasn't just strict rule enforcement, it was calculated harassment. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Sergeant Brian Foster, one of my deputies who lived in the next subdivision. "Chief, you're not going to leave of this. Remember that drainage issue last spring? Just found out Ryan Caldwell's company got the contract, and the price was 3 times higher than the lowest bid." I leaned back in my chair, my pulse steady, but my rage burning beneath the surface. This wasn't just about petty power trips or HOA fines anymore. This was corruption, and I was going to bring it all crashing down. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the evidence piling up before me. Karen had laughed in my face earlier that day, her smug smile never wavering as she spat out her favorite phrase, "Rules are rules." But now I saw it for what it really was, a power trip, plain and simple, and possibly something even worse. Just then, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Helen Chang, my elderly neighbor who had lived in this community longer than anyone. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder before speaking in a whisper. Chief, I saw them installing cameras on the streetlights today. They didn't ask permission. My stomach twisted. Cameras? She nodded. Karen says it's for security, but they're all pointed at specific houses, including yours. My jaw tightened. Unauthorized surveillance in my jurisdiction? That wasn't just an HOA overreach. That was potentially illegal. But I couldn't act yet. If I moved too quickly, Karen would play the victim. She'd claim I was abusing my power as chief of police, turning it into a personal vendetta. I needed airtight evidence before I made my move. I walked Mrs. Chang back home, scanning the neighborhood as I did. That's when I saw her. Karen was in her driveway, deep in conversation with two men I didn't recognize. They wore the same fake uniforms from her brother's security company, but something about them felt off. Too stiff, too controlled. Not the type of guys who work HOA patrol. My gut twisted. There was more to this. 20 years in law enforcement had taught me one thing: always trust your gut. And my gut was screaming that Karen had built something bigger than a petty HOA dictatorship. Something rotten. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, remembering something my old mentor used to say. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Karen had built a kingdom of fear and intimidation, but she'd made a critical mistake. She'd gotten too confident, too sloppy. She thought she was watching us. She had no idea we were watching her too. And tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day at the HOA meeting. I couldn't sleep that night. Karen's control over the neighborhood wasn't just about HOA rules. It was something bigger, something calculated. Sitting in my kitchen at dawn, coffee in hand, I thought back to my early days as a rookie cop. My mentor had drilled one lesson into my head. If something doesn't make sense, follow the money. That security company, Caldwell Protective Services, had been too eager to do Karen's dirty work. Their badges looked fake, their uniforms too new, and their so-called officers acted more like hired muscle than licensed professionals. At work, I pulled aside Jenny from records and asked her to run a business check on them. Within minutes, my suspicions were confirmed. The company had been registered only 3 months ago, right after Karen had taken control of the HOA board. The owner's last name? Caldwell, Karen's maiden name. And their business address? A P.O. box. No physical office. No listed employees. This wasn't just about HOA violations anymore. This was fraud. At lunchtime, I drove by Emily Bennett's house. She was just getting home from her hospital shift, her face pale from exhaustion. "Chief," she called out when she saw me. "They left another notice this morning. I can't keep paying these fines on a nurse's salary." She handed me a stack of citations, each one signed by Karen, each one citing obscure rules that seemed to target working people specifically. Back at the station, I dug deeper. Ryan Caldwell, Karen's brother, had a history of failed security companies across 3 different states. Every time complaints piled up, reports of aggressive tactics, unauthorized vehicle blocking, and harassment. But every time the company shut down before any real investigation could happen. Karen hadn't just hired a security company. She had created one, and she was using it to squeeze money from the very people keeping this community running. My next stop? The county clerk's office. And I had a feeling what I found there would be even worse. At the county clerk's office, I flipped through 6 months of HOA filings, my eyes scanning for anything Karen hadn't wanted the public to see. And then I found it. Karen never disclosed her connection to Caldwell Protective Services when the HOA approved the contract. That was a direct violation of conflict of interest rules, the very rules she had used to punish others for far less. But the real gold mine? Karen had been running an unlicensed daycare center from her garage. 6 kids, no proper safety permits, no state child care license. The same HOA bylaws she had weaponized against homeowners, citing people for running small businesses out of their homes, applied to her. And she had been breaking them the whole time. Before I could process the full weight of what I had, my phone buzzed. A text from David Morgan, the firefighter. "Chief, you need to see this." Attached were photos of Caldwell Protective Services vehicles parked directly in fire lanes around the neighborhood. His next message was blunt. If we get a house fire, we won't be able to get a truck through in time. This is a disaster waiting to happen. I clenched my jaw. Karen wasn't just abusing her power, she was putting lives at risk. I spent the next few hours at the police station assembling my case. Property maps showed Karen had illegally extended her backyard fence 2 feet past her property line. Security footage from my cruiser confirmed multiple instances of her so-called security team blocking emergency vehicle access. And the HOA's financial records? They showed exactly what I expected. Karen had been pushing the board to increase violation fines while directing all security contracts to her brother's fake company. The evidence was overwhelming, but Karen had friends on the city council. If I wanted this to stick, I had to do it right. I backed up every file, printed copies, and saved digital versions in multiple places. Years as a cop had taught me never to go into a fight without insurance. Just as I finished, Officer Jason Reynolds burst into my office, breathless. "Chief, you won't believe this." "Chief, you won't believe this. Karen's security company just tried to boot Dr. Thompson's car at the emergency room entrance." I read Officer Reynolds' message twice, my blood boiling. Dr. Thompson was one of the top surgeons in the county, likely rushing in to save someone's life. And Karen's fake security team had been harassing him over parking rules? That was it. I leaned back in my chair, eyes scanning the wall of evidence I had built over the past few days. Karen thought she was untouchable, but she had made a critical mistake. She'd gotten greedy, too confident, and now she was going to walk right into her own trap. My phone buzzed again. Sergeant Foster. "Karen just submitted a proposal for expanded security measures. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow night." I smiled. Perfect. The next evening, I walked into the HOA meeting, my face calm, but my heart pounding with anticipation. Karen stood at the front of the room, dressed in her usual designer suit, holding a stack of papers detailing her latest safety initiative. I watched as she spoke, her voice full of fake concern. "We need stronger security," she declared. "More cameras, more patrols, more enforcement." The room was silent. People were exhausted from her endless rules, but no one dared to speak up. Karen's confidence grew and she finally asked, "Shall we vote?" I raised my hand. The familiar weight of my badge in my pocket gave me strength. "Before we vote," I said, standing slowly, "I think there's something everyone needs to know." Karen's smirk faltered. She narrowed her eyes, not recognizing me out of uniform. "And who exactly are you?" she asked, her voice sharp. I let the moment linger, then pulled a thick stack of papers from my folder. "I'm Chief Carter," I said, "and I've been investigating you." The projector clicked on, and the first image filled the screen, a clear, undeniable shot of Karen's illegal home business setup. I turned to face her. "These pictures show an unlicensed daycare operation running out of your house, Mrs. Caldwell. That's against both HOA rules and state regulations." The color drained from Karen's face, then returned in an angry red flush. "How dare you? This is private property," she snapped, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. I remained calm, clicking to the next slide. "Neither is this business registration showing your brother owns Caldwell Protective Services, the same company now patrolling our streets without proper licensing." The room erupted in whispers. I let them talk for a moment before continuing. "While you've been fining Emily Bennett, our local ER nurse, for leaving her trash bins out an extra hour after a night shift, you've been running an illegal business. While you cited David Morgan's kids for their basketball hoop, your so-called security company has been operating without permits." A voice spoke up from the back. Mrs. Chang. "She fined me $200 for my Chinese New Year decorations." More voices joined in, one after another. "She fined me for my rose bushes." "She gave me a citation for my garden gnome." My grandkids weren't even allowed to draw with chalk on the sidewalk. Karen's composure cracked as the crowd turned against her. She grabbed her stack of papers, ready to storm out. But Mr. Jenkins, the HOA president, stepped in front of the door. "Not so fast, Karen. We need to discuss this." I clicked to the final slide, an official police report. "And here's the biggest problem," I said, my voice steady. "Your security company has been writing tickets and blocking driveways without any legal authority to do so. That's impersonating law enforcement, a serious offense." Karen's perfect mask finally shattered. You can't prove anything, she shrieked. I was making this neighborhood better. But the truth was already out, and Karen's empire of control was crumbling before her eyes. Karen stood frozen, her knuckles white as she clutched her clipboard. People need rules, she snapped, voice tight with anger. Rules apply to everyone. I met her glare with an even stare, including you. The room erupted in applause. Mr. Jenkins, the HOA president, wasted no time. I'm calling for an emergency vote. Hands shot up across the room, a sea of people who had endured Karen's tyranny for far too long. The result was unanimous. Karen wasn't just removed from the HOA board, she was banned from ever serving again. Her face twisted with fury as she pushed past neighbors to leave, her heels clicking against the tile like a judge's gavel. At the door, she whipped around, eyes glassy with rage. This isn't over, she spat. I watched her go, then turned back to the united community standing beside me. Karen didn't realize something crucial. She'd been able to bully people when they felt isolated, but now they weren't afraid anymore. Sometimes justice wears a badge, and sometimes it just needs someone to stand up and tell the truth. The silence in the room was deafening as I stood at the front of the HOA meeting, letting the weight of the evidence sink in. Karen gripped the table, her knuckles white, eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. But there wasn't one, not anymore. Mrs. Thompson, the longest-serving HOA board member, cleared her throat. Chief Carter, what are you suggesting we do? I set my folder down, glancing at the crowd. It's simple. The HOA needs a full audit of every fine issued under Karen's leadership. Every unjust violation must be reversed, and any funds collected under false pretenses should be refunded to the homeowners. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. I turned back to Mr. Jenkins, the HOA president. Second, Caldwell Protective Services must be removed from the neighborhood immediately. They are not licensed, they are not legitimate, and they have no legal authority to operate here. Mr. Jenkins nodded. Karen's brother, Ryan Caldwell, stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. This is ridiculous. You can't just shut us down. I held up a document. Actually, I can. This is a cease and desist order signed by a judge earlier today. Effective immediately, your company is barred from operating in this county. Ryan's face drained of color. Karen lunged forward, slamming her hands on the table. This is a witch hunt! You're all turning against me because I actually wanted to improve this neighborhood. A voice cut through the room. It was Emily Bennett, the ER nurse Karen had harassed for months. You didn't improve anything, Karen. You terrorized us. More neighbors spoke up. You fined me for my wheelchair ramp. You threatened to put a lien on my house over a garden gnome. You blocked fire trucks from getting through. Karen's chest rose and fell quickly, her breathing sharp, her hands shaking with rage. But this time, she had no power left. Mr. Jenkins tapped his gavel on the table. We will be voting to permanently ban Karen Caldwell from ever holding an HOA position again. He barely finished his sentence before a sea of hands shot up. It was unanimous. Karen stumbled back, her face pale. She turned toward me, her eyes burning with fury. You think you've won? She hissed. This isn't over. I folded my arms. No, Karen, it is over. She stormed out, her heels clicking violently against the tile, shoving past the crowd as the HOA officially erased her reign of terror. As I watched her leave, I saw something far more important than Karen's defeat. A neighborhood that had been divided for months was finally standing together again. Over the next few weeks, the community began to heal. All of Karen's unjust fines were overturned. Homeowners who had paid unnecessary fees were refunded. Caldwell Protective Services was permanently shut down. And Karen, well, she moved out of the neighborhood within a month. Rumor had it she tried joining an HOA board in a different town. But somehow, word had already spread. A few days later, I was watering my lawn when Emily's daughter ran up to me, holding a small card. Inside was a crayon drawing of me in my uniform, standing in front of a bright, colorful house. The message inside read, "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." I set it on my desk at the station where it still sits today. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from a badge or a courtroom. Sometimes it just takes one person standing up so others can finally find their voice. And that's exactly what we did. This story is more than just the fall of a power-hungry HOA president. It's a reminder of what happens when people let fear keep them silent. Karen thrived on control because, for a while, no one pushed back. She weaponized rules, twisting them into a tool for personal gain, and targeted the very people who kept the community running: nurses, firefighters, teachers, and senior citizens. But as soon as one person, Michael Carter, stood up, others found the courage to speak out. That's the real lesson here. Abuse of power only lasts as long as people allow it. Another key takeaway? Follow the money. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was running a scheme, profiting from unfair fines while funneling HOA funds into her brother's fake security company. Greed often hides behind the mask of authority, and when people fail to ask questions, corruption thrives. But the moment Michael dug deeper, followed the paper trail, and exposed the truth, Karen's empire crumbled. Lastly, justice isn't just about the law, it's about standing together. Karen controlled the neighborhood by making people feel alone, but in the end, unity won. Once the community realized their collective power, Karen lost hers. This story teaches us that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in courtrooms, but in small meetings, front yards, and everyday conversations. The next time someone abuses their authority, remember this: one voice can spark change, but many voices together can make it unstoppable.